Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
What if air was poisonous and it just took 80 years to kill us? And I saw that poster somewhere, and it's just been on the tip of my tongue. One of those nonsensical things that just funny, made me laugh. Glad you're here. My name is Seth Andrews, and I am hot off an amazing weekend in Denver at the Colorado Secular Conference, and a huge thank you to everybody who came out. It was one of those days. Remember the Reason Rally? When it was cold and rainy and everybody had a wonderful time anyway. Well, at the Colorado Secular Conference, we had some challenges with the air conditioning in the facility. I don't know, somebody somewhere didn't flip a switch, and so you're looking at an entire day of people in this sweatbox of an auditorium. And we still had a wonderful day. Despite the challenges, we had a wonderful day. Huge thanks out to Kim and the Secular Hub and all the good folks out there who put on the event. My next stop is going to be on next week, actually, on the 31st. We're going to be in Clearwater, Florida. And all the details are on my website. You can go to thethinkingatheist.com/tour. And it's going to be a great time. I'm actually cheating a little bit. I'm using it as an opportunity to also get some downtime, to get my family and to get out of town. It's funny. I used to travel a lot for my day job. I mean, all the time. And so vacation was home vacation, staycation. I don't want to travel. I travel for a living. I don't want to get on a plane. I don't want to get in a car. I want to stay home. I want to sleep in. I want to play tennis. I want to relax. So for the first time in like half a decade, I'm actually taking a week-long vacation out of the state. And Natalie and I are going to go and get our toes in the sand down there in Florida for a few days. And you know what's funny? When you're preparing to go on vacation, it's almost more work than not going, right? And by the time all right, I got to get this, we got the house sitter taking care of that, instructions of what to do every single day. All right, we got to catch up on the huge inbox for the office and then prepare for what's going to be there when I get back. And then you've got all of the stuff with the Thinking Atheist and the podcast. There will be a podcast next week, and I'll just give you a heads up. I cheated. It's an interview with Jerry DeWitt on the heels of the release of his book, Hope After Faith. And I just love Jerry with all my heart. I mean, I just love that guy. And we have an hour-long show that will air at its regular time, and I'll give you a little tip. Pre-record it, because my ass is going to be on the beach in Florida. But I wanted to make sure there was a show in place so everybody would have something to listen to. So I'm very excited about that. We're talking tonight about secular parenting. And this has been a little bit of I don't know, I've seen some people on Facebook going back and forth about it. They are talking about, can you indoctrinate a child into atheism? And I'm like, and some people say it's impossible to indoctrinate a child to be an atheist. And I wholeheartedly disagree. Now, I'm going to ask Dale McGowan about this. But I think if they are an atheist for the wrong reasons, if they're an atheist because you gave them no other choice, because you said atheism is it, that's the truth, that's the way to go, non-belief is it. If you push them into that, then you have essentially done what the religious often do to their children. And you can indoctrinate a child into atheism. I don't know, we'll have to ask an expert about it. My special guest tonight, Dale McGowan, has edited and co-authored several books, including Parenting Beyond Belief and Raising Free Thinkers, the first comprehensive resources for non-religious parents, plus a new book called Atheism for Dummies. He writes the secular parenting blog called The Meaning of Life. And in 2008, he was named Harvard Humanist of the Year. He joins me on the air this evening. Dale McGowan, glad you made it, my friend. Thanks for coming.
Good to be here. Thanks.
You have had a lot of experience when it comes to being, number one, an atheist. And you just say it outright, right? You don't believe in any deity anywhere, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you speak all around the country on the issue of secular parenting. And you make a great distinction. When we saw you speak at the Oklahoma Free Thought Convention, you were talking about, I don't want to raise a free thinker with a capital F. And I want you to kind of go down that road for me. I mean, what are we talking about?
Well, sure. The original meaning of free thinker, when it was first coined, 17th century, I think was the first use, was someone who thinks independently of church orthodoxy. And it didn't necessarily mean someone who was a non-believer, someone who was an atheist. But over time, especially by the time we get to the 19th century, free thinker began to be synonymous with atheist. It was often used with a capital F. And one of the things that people can fall into very easily, as they can with any belief system, is the feeling that you have to believe a certain thing, you have to think in a particular way in order to be a free thinker. And the irony is when you say you have to come to the conclusions that I've come to, or you're not a free thinker. And I've heard people say that exact thing. And you can argue that someone has used a thought process that's not valid, or is using fallacious arguments or something like that. But to just declare that the definition of a free thinker is someone who comes to this particular set of conclusions, that to me is too ironic to bear. I'd rather use free thinker with the lowercase f and really use it in its original meaning, which is someone who is thinking independently of orthodoxy and authority and tradition.
How many kids do you have?
3.
And they are how old?
They are 17, 15, and 11.
Wow, 2 teenagers at the same time, pushing 3.
Yeah.
So how is it? You doing well? Everybody good?
Oh yeah, everybody's doing all right. It is. I will say that it's challenging. It's going through all the transitions from really from the time they leave elementary school. You start getting those rapid transitions and growth, and it's very interesting and exciting and also challenging.
So are they surrounded by religion at all, or is it atheism only at home? How do you approach your own children when it comes to free thinking?
Well, one of the things I've been careful about from the very beginning is making sure that they are in the driver's seat as much as they can possibly be with these metaphysical decisions. And I'm keeping this separate from questions of science and that sort of thing. That's not the same. I don't have to pretend that the jury is out on a lot of scientific questions. But when it comes to metaphysics, I can agree that there are a lot of open questions. I have very strong convictions on these, but I want my kids to come to their own judgments about this. So one of the things that's been very important to me is that I leave this space around them as they're growing up. They have the space to think, and my wife and I have instilled them with curiosity about the world, a sense of wonder about the world. But then we want to leave that space around them so that they can ask the questions that will allow them to come to their own conclusions. I think that's a very important thing. And part of creating the space is making sure that they have access to other voices as well. And so we've been very intentional about not only saying you can go out and explore anything you want, but pointing them to people with other points of view, pointing to them to religious relatives who we trust to not abuse the opportunity. And say, you ought to talk to your grandma. I know that she believes differently from me. And at one time, my wife was Christian as well for the first 13 years of our marriage. So a lot of times I could just point down the hall and say, hey, go talk to Mom. I know that she has a different opinion on this. So it's just been very much that way, totally owning my position, owning my opinions on these issues, but then saying, I want you to seek out other people who think differently and then make up your own mind.
So one of your children comes to you and they say, hey, someone wants me to go to church with them. They're Christians and they say, hey, I'm invited. The churches are always going after young people anyway. And quite often they'll create an incentive for people to bring their friends. So let's say your son comes to you and says, "Hey, Dad, I really want to go to church on Sunday." How would you approach that?
Oh, you definitely let them go. But you assess the situation the best you can in advance. And if it's a situation that I'm skittish about, because I think you can put them in a situation where they are going to be manipulated, they can be made fearful. I never want my kids to make decisions out of fear. So if I think that's the case, I might go with them to it so that we can experience it together. We can talk about it afterwards. But if it's more of a sort of mainstream situation where I don't think they're going to be exposed to that, and it's a friend or it's a religious relative or something who I trust, then absolutely I let them go. I think we actually run a great risk if we forbid them to go, if we say that you can't go. First of all, it makes us look like we're afraid of something there, and I don't think that's a position. I don't want my kids to think that I'm afraid of religion. I'm not afraid of it. I've actually assessed it very carefully, and I know where I stand. But I'm fine with them accessing it. But the other thing that can happen is we can create this sort of forbidden fruit. And if your parents seem really freaked out by what goes on behind that stained glass, then you get to a point in your life where you're having troubles, you're uncertain about your values or whatever, and there's this magical thing behind the stained glass. I wonder what's back there that has my parents so freaked out. And that's when you can get a kid who really is sucked into the evangelical charismatic side of things. And I didn't want that to happen. So I wanted to be very open about allowing them to access these opportunities and even proactively taking them myself.
You have me intrigued. I want to go back just a little bit. You mentioned that your wife was a believer. Is this a subject we can approach here? Is this safe ground here, Dave?
Absolutely. Perfectly safe, yeah.
Okay, so when you met, though, were you already a skeptic, or were you both Christians and you both kind of fell out at different points?
I already was. I was a committed atheist, really pretty much from, I'd say by the middle of high school. I was confident in that, even approaching it at age 13. My wife was a committed Christian. She was raised in a Southern Baptist family. Her parents met at a Baptist college. Her grandfather was a Baptist minister. Her uncle's a Baptist minister, and this was a very religious family. She herself was religious, but not kind of in the starry-eyed charismatic way, or believe me, there wouldn't have been an attraction there. So anyway, yeah, she was a committed but fairly mainstream, I think I'd say, Christian believer from the time we were married, and I was a committed atheist.
So what was her ticket out? What was it? Just kind of watching you from the wings? Was she going through her own doubts and struggles?
Yeah, she had begun sort of noticing things, noticing inconsistencies, asking questions and that sort of thing, even as early as college. But she had, it's interesting, I'm actually working on a book right now on the secular religious mixed marriage, and I talk a little bit about how complicated these things are. Her interest in the church had a lot more to do with family history than it did with theological belief. She had the sort of default theological beliefs, but it was really about something else that was going on. And it would take a very long time to describe, but what she did over time, we worked it out. We talked about how we were going to raise the kids, and we both agreed that we were very comfortable with them thinking for themselves, making their own decisions in this. We agreed that we would speak of things in terms of I statements. This is something that I believe is true. And then be willing to point to the other parent. Then around, I think it was around 04, 05, something like that, I was doing a lot of reading, everybody sort of goes through that period as an atheist where you just suddenly immerse yourself in the literature. There's got to be a name for that period. Somebody's got to name that. But mine was from about 98 to, 05 or something like that when I was really immersed. And this was also a period when my kids would start asking religious questions once in a while when they'd come across something, or they'd see a televangelist on TV when I was watching it, because I used to watch them for fun. And they would come and ask a question, and I would talk to them, and we would just kind of, have these great discussions. And she began listening to these discussions, and then she began joining in a little bit, and then she started picking up the books that I was reading and reading through those. Karen Armstrong, A.N. Wilson. This was before the Four Horsemen had really saddled up in a serious way. And she just eventually said, a couple of years later, our daughter went to her and asked her point blank, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "I actually don't believe in God, but I wish there was a God," was her answer. And that was the first time I knew it. Wow. That's the first time I heard it, was in this, overhearing her telling our daughter that. So it was a long process. I didn't push at all. I wasn't at all interested in converting her or anything like that. I was perfectly satisfied with, I never needed her to change in any way. And we had worked out all the differences in, raising the kids and all that. But it was just really a gradual process of her becoming more interested in the questions and then eventually just letting the beliefs go.
Well, what about all these clergy men and women on the family tree? They must be watching you guys like it's a car wreck. I mean, they're like, somebody saved the grandchildren. I mean, I often see this, right? You'll see Christian relatives looking from the periphery, and they look in and say, "I cannot believe you're not going to raise your children in church," and it becomes a huge point of contention. Have you had to deal with any of that?
Remarkably little, very, very little. And this is something that has surprised and delighted me, because this is not a mildly religious family. But at the same time, they have, I guess one of the ways I describe it is that they have the ability to compartmentalize. And everybody, you're familiar with that idea that they already liked me a lot for years and years and years before they knew. My wife knew what my position was, but it was many years before they knew that I was an atheist. And my mother-in-law, for example, very religious woman, found out when she came out for my son's birthday, turning 5 years old, and he said, "Grandma, do you believe in God?" And she said, "Well, I very much believe in God." And he said, "Oh, because Daddy doesn't." There it was. So
you're outed by your own offspring.
Outed by my offspring, which is apparently very, very common. I've heard that story many, many times. And the way she responded was beautiful. It threw her. It definitely threw her for a while. Wow. And but what she worried mostly about, I found out later, and this is very common with secular families with an extended family that's religious, she was actually worried that she wouldn't be able to share her faith with her grandchildren. This is something that she had, wasn't so much a matter of converting them or saving them, but this was something she had pictured all her life, that she was eventually going to be a grandmother and she was going to be able to tell her grandchildren about Jesus and how much he loves us and that sort of thing. So when I learned in a way that's also kind of a long story, but I eventually learned that this was what she was concerned about. And I was able to actually extend an invitation, because she had shown herself at this point to just be really good about it and very trustworthy and accepting. And then I was able to say, "Hey, you know what, let's sit down sometime." And you and me and Connor, at that point, he's about 6 years old, and he had begun asking a lot of questions about belief. And I said, "Why don't we sit down and, have a cup of hot chocolate, and you can tell Connor what you believe." And that was a really important breakthrough moment, I think, in our relationship, that she was not only was I not pushing her aside, but was actually inviting her in to the religious education of her grandchildren. And that was huge. I think that was something that cemented our relationship in a really good way from then on. And I was there, so she knew that I didn't want them scared. I don't want my kids to have hellfire and damnation poured on them, but you can tell them what you believe. And I also have always made it clear, that they have to be able to ask any questions they want. You can't freak out when they ask a question, and you've got to answer it as straightforwardly as you possibly can. And that has worked out really beautifully for everybody. It's allowed us to be in the context of a religious extended family, and at the same time involve them in a way that has reasonable constraints on it, that has been very, very positive for everybody.
Talking here with Dale McGowan, I've got some situational stuff I want to toss at you, and then I would like to go to the switchboard because I know we have some callers who have some questions for you. But I'd like you to indulge me if you can. I know you probably have told the story 100,000 times, but at the Oklahoma Free Thought Convention, you talked about your son and Santa Claus and his sort of coming to the truth, right? Or coming to his own realization of what actually was going on. And it's such a priceless story. I'm going to beg you to tell it here. Can you kind of give our listeners the taste of kind of how did you get through the Santa Claus question with your kid? And then we can tie that into Jesus afterwards if you'd like.
Oh gosh, yes, you have to tie it into Jesus because it's the perfect tie-in. We sort of stumbled into the Santa thing, frankly. I mean, we just started doing it at the beginning because we had done that as kids, and I hadn't really thought through in any intentional way what we were doing. But I did wonder. I thought, oh, is this something I really want to be doing? But it began to occur to me early on that there was something really powerful going on in allowing kids to engage in the Santa story with a very light touch. We did it in this I think it's important to do it with a fairly light touch, not force them into the belief and keep them in the belief until they're 14 years old, all that sort of thing. But I began to notice that children have a will to believe that precedes their will to know. There are certain things that they want to be true, and so they will believe them, even in the face of fairly ridiculous evidence. So one of the things that kids do, and I think a lot of parents will attest to this, when they start messing around the edges of the Santa myth, they rarely come up to the parent and say, is Santa real? They don't look you in the eye and ask you for the disconfirmation. What they do is come up with an ancillary question. They come up, and this is what my son did. He came up and said, how do the reindeer fly? And I said, well, some people say, because that's the way I would always start it. I wouldn't just say, here's how they fly. I said, well, some people say they eat magic corn. That was the thing that popped into the stupidest. I mean, that is a really dumb answer. But what did he do? He said, okay, and he ran off to play. This is a science-minded, very rational kid. But his will to believe was greater than his will to know at that point. And so my position was, super. If your will to believe is stronger, you go with that, because I knew for a fact that eventually the will to know would overpower that. And I wanted it to be under his power. So he'd come back and say, how does Santa, go around the world in one night? And all these, he'd have these little questions because it was just bugging his mind. And then finally, when he was about 9 years old, he was ready. And I knew that because we were in the Target parking lot, walking into the Target. Snow was coming down, the Salvation Army bell ringer, and he said, "Dad, is Santa real?" Asked me point blank, and I said, "Well, what do you think?" And he said, his face just got all tight and a big smile, and he said, "I think it's the moms and dads." And I said, "You got it, you figured it out." And he said, "Oh, good." And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean, oh, good? And he said, well, the world makes sense again. Because he had actually heard all this stuff about the world and gravity and physics and all this sort of stuff. And then there's this magic man at the North Pole with the flying reindeer it just didn't make any sense. And so he was actually thrilled to get rid of that. So what I came to realize is that our culture has set up a silly temporary myth right next to our silly permanent one. We've got this myth system that kids can play around in, and they are all expected to figure their way out of it eventually. And, nobody is still Santa believing at 35, one would hope. So what they did, I gave my kids the opportunity to find their way out of a myth system under their own power by eventually allowing the will to know to trump that desire to believe. Then they get out of that one, the world makes sense again, and then what are they confronted with? Okay, now there's this other magic man who you never see and who gives you gifts and who punishes you if you're bad. And I think it's an opportunity. Santa Claus becomes what I call the ultimate dry run in critical thinking for actually thinking your way out of a myth system.
I have someone on my chat room ask me a question about Santa and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. I think there's a nervousness that, look, if we entertain this fantasy, are we then setting them up for Jesus? Are we doing them a disservice in some way?
Some people think that, and I think if you come to that conclusion, that's perfectly fine. I don't think anybody has to do one or the other. But I found it to be precisely the opposite, because this one ends in disconfirmation. And and if it's disconfirmation under their own power, then I think they're much more likely to take that lesson over into the other side than they are to somehow go back into magical thinking in terms of religion. So I know people do worry about that. I haven't remotely found that to be the case.
You pretty much live it exactly what you believe or do not believe is absolutely transparent to your children, right? They know what you're about.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I think it's a mistake to hide what you value in that way.
So let's say that you want to raise a free thinker. A lot of the people in my community are talking about, geez, I just don't want them to get co-opted by religion. I just don't want them to end up somewhere where they're worshiping the myth, and I'm nervous I'm going to screw up. How much influence do I have? How do I guide them? What tools do I give them? So that's where I want to start here. I mean, what tools, what's the process? How do you create an environment where you can get your kids to think for themselves and know that you've done at least most of what you can to keep them from one day getting sort of sucker punched by the fantasy stories that come along in their lives?
Yeah, I think it's a concern well worth having. And it's one I certainly had in the beginning as well. And I can say that my concern has diminished year after year as my kids have gotten older, and I've seen what happens when you start them off right. It is actually harder to indoctrinate a child into religious ideas in a way, because you have to protect them from, everybody's seen this as well, you have to protect them from competing ideas. And this is what they're often told in the church from the very beginning, that if you hear ideas that challenge your belief, it's the devil speaking to you or whatever, and you have to run away from the idea. All you have to do is remove that pressure, right? Remove that bubble that's protecting them from ideas, and instill two things from the beginning, right from the time they're very young. One of them is critical thinking, just the value of that. But the thing that's going to drive the critical thinking is actually a sense of wonder. If from the very earliest age, you can help your kids find the world wonderful, just consider the world to be an amazing place unconditionally. No matter whether there's a God, whether there's not a God, it doesn't matter. It's amazing. And then you tell them critical thinking is the way to discover how it works. It's the way to get inside of it. So you start with the wonder by looking at something and saying, oh my gosh, look at that. That's amazing. I wonder how it works. I wonder how that the Venus flytrap closes on my finger when I put it in, or whatever it is. Any one of a million different observations you have when your kids are little. So you start with, wow, look at that. And then the question, I wonder how that works, or I wonder why the sunset is red, or whatever it is. And you help guide them into the answer. And we all know that the actual answers are phenomenal. They're spectacular. They're awe-inspiring. And once kids get addicted to that kind of wonder, religious wonder really pales by comparison, in my opinion. I don't think it holds a candle to scientific naturalistic wonder. So all you have to do from the beginning, you don't have to guide them by the nose to your beliefs. Give them wonder first and foremost, and then critical thinking as a tool. And they will find their way forward, and they tend to become very impatient with nonsense when that's the case, because they've fallen in love with the world. They really want to see that. And anything that puts a smoke screen up between you and reality ends up being something that's an irritant rather than something to run to.
Talking here with Dale McGowan. I promise you on the switchboard I will get to you, but I just got to toss this out. At the convention, you said that you have given your kids permission to change their minds 1,000 times. Now, for those of us who were raised under Jesus is real and never question it, I have a real envy. I'm jealous of your kids. Oh, what's that like to be able to be encouraged to go out and And that's not a real popular thing to say. I mean, look, if you found truth, why would you ever need to change your mind? But you encourage your kids, go out and you have the permission, give yourself the permission to change your mind on a subject. Do you want to elaborate on that for the audience?
Yeah, that's actually been one of my favorite mantras around my kids when they were really young is, not only that you get to make up your own mind, you get to choose what you think about these big issues, but the invitation to change their minds is a very unusual thing. It's not something that most kids hear. Not only do you get to choose your position, but you then don't have to sink your feet in cement, which means that you can be much lighter about the whole process. You don't have to be so darn melodramatic about it. So you believe in God, which my kids, at least two of my kids, went through a period of time when they had, when they were very young, and they had basic Jesus loves me New Testament type beliefs for about 2 weeks, and then they were on to some, my youngest was sort of an Einsteinian pantheist for a while. She was describing things in ways that were sort of pantheistic when she was like 6 years old. And then she became really a secular humanist for a while, where she's really describing things in terms of taking care of each other. And I don't think there's a God who's controlling things. And she was just really, really interested and engaged in that. And I kept just saying, that is so cool. Keep thinking about it. Keep thinking about it. You can change your mind as much as you want. And as a result, she's examined the question from all different angles. And she ends up with a much stronger position, a much more confident and relaxed position.
Because she came to it on her own and it wasn't spoon-fed to her.
Yeah, and that's really one of the most important messages I ever talk about. And I know that my confidence in something is greater when I came to it myself. I think most people have had this experience. If somebody tells you something is true, you might say, okay, and a lot of your confidence in it will be based on your confidence in that person, right, in the authority of that person. But if I have actually examined the evidence for something and worked it out in my own head and come to it myself, the foundation under that belief is so much stronger. That's what I want my kids to have. That's what I have. Because nobody handed me atheism. I mean, by no means was I encouraged in that direction as a kid, but I was given space to think for myself and made curious. And I loved the questions. I loved these questions. They're the most interesting questions you can ask. So I asked them, and I looked at the evidence, and I really cared about the answers, cared about getting the answers right. And as a result, my confidence in my worldview is extraordinary. It's very, very strong, and I want my kids to have that same thing. And the way to get it is to not have somebody lead you to it, but to get to it yourself. And I can help them by giving them experiences, by letting them hear voices, by helping them fall in love with the world, by encouraging critical thinking. But ultimately, I need to keep their hands on the wheel as much as possible so that they end up with that confident worldview.
Let's hit the switchboard if you have a few extra minutes here and see what our callers have to bring to the table. Let's try Josh on Skype. Thanks for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast.
Hi, Zap. How you going, mate?
It's good to hear your voice, my friend. What's going on with you?
I'd just like to ask Dale what he thinks about teaching religion to intellectually impaired children or children with disabilities as opposed to sort of regular children. Because myself and my wife, we have a 9-year-old who's intellectually impaired. So basically he's got a low IQ, he's a slow thinker, he has difficulty with problem solving and critical thinking, and he basically can be easily led. So we haven't really delved into religion with him. He has enough trouble just trying to read and write and such things. What do you think about teaching disabled children or intellectually impaired children religion?
Yeah, I have to start with the caveat that I try to not give advice when I don't have any idea what I'm talking about. And, because I haven't had a child who's intellectually impaired myself, there's a limit to what I can say. But there are a few things that I know from talking to other parents who've been in a similar situation. One of the things with any child, regardless of their abilities, is that you want them to encounter these ideas when they're ready and at the level and in the way that they're ready. And so you will know your child, and you'll know that if your child is on a delayed schedule in terms of their ability to get at these ideas, I wouldn't push it in the least. I would make sure that they are protected from other people pushing it, especially if you feel your child can be easily led, if that's part of the disability. But just making sure that when they are ready to access these ideas, even if it's much older than a child would otherwise be, that they have access to those ideas, that if you tell stories at bedtime, as I've done with my kids, you can include myths among the stories. That's one of the ways that you can just sort of keep the information and the environment present for the child. And then when the child is ready to ask questions about it or explore it further, then it's there for them to grab and respond to. But I wouldn't push by any means. I'd allow them to really control the timetable.
Yeah, we haven't really raised him with religion at all. We've got an older son who's 14, and being in Australia, we're not as religious as in America, as I understand it. And it's just not a big deal over here with our, in general, with our 14-year-old. I've just said to him, look, you can believe what you want, but have a good reason for believing it. Be able to give me good reasons and think critically, as you've said, to raise the kids that way.
Right, yeah.
And I've said to him, look, I'll take you to any church you want. I've got a King James Bible. I've got the Quran here. I've said, here are these books. You can read them. I'll talk about it with you if you want to. But frankly, he's more interested in skateboarding and hanging out with his mates. And
see, and that's actually
than religion at all.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I think what you just described is perfect. It's exactly the kind of approach you want to take. And kids will vary in their interest in these things. My two oldest really didn't have much interest in depth in religious questions until they were older. Until once they got into high school, they became really interested in certain aspects of it, especially as they saw their peers with different religious expressions and saying various things, and they became interested. My youngest was interested from preschool, from fourth grade. She was already engaging in these questions and just latching on and running with them. So I didn't push the older ones at all. Just that same kind of low-key exposure, just like you did. You sort of, you have the opportunity to do this if you want. We read the myths. We occasionally saw movies with a religious theme from various religions, not just the West. But that's really the best you can do. I think that's ideal.
Josh, I appreciate the call, my friend. Thank you so much for being part of the show.
Not a problem, mate.
All right, take care of yourself.
Catch up with you.
All right.
See you, buddy.
I've had so many emails on this next subject. I'm just going to sort of turn them into a composite question. It's there. I must have gotten half a dozen variations on. Look, I'm not a believer. My spouse is a true believer. She wants the kids baptized. She wants them in church every Sunday. This is a real challenge when you have two parents operating on two different frequencies and the kids are often right there torn in the middle. Do you want to help us speak to that? I mean, that's a real challenge.
Yeah, well, this is the book I'm working on right now, and it is a real challenge. Sometimes there is actually a tremendous amount of variation in this, and one of the things you want to do is be sure that you've had the conversation with your spouse. Well, ideally, you have the conversation before you get married. That's what we did. As early as possible, you want to be sure all the cards are on the table, and there's sort of an understanding of what the approach is going to be as early as you can possibly do it. But really, at any point, you can start with the idea of the best way to describe this is that everybody comes into a relationship with negotiables and non-negotiables. They come in with the things that they want to happen, but then there are other things that they need to happen that are really non-negotiable. And one of them for me that was a need is that I needed for my children to have the right to make up their own mind. I really needed them to be allowed to make their own choice and to not have any labels put on them early on. And that was fine with my wife. One of the things that was non-negotiable for my wife is that she really wanted to go to church. And she said, ideally, I'd really like you to go with me. And it had nothing to do with saving me. It was, again, it was this family issue thing. That's a long story. But that was fine with me because my preference would have been to not go to church. But it was negotiable, and I was willing to do that. And so there's a matter of give and take on these things. One of the things that we talked about early on was baptism, and I was uncomfortable. And this one I screwed up a little bit. I was uncomfortable with the idea of baptism because that's a real claim that the church is putting on your child. You know, they're really saying you are anointed in the Spirit of God. I wasn't comfortable with that, and she said, "That's okay. Would it be okay if we do a dedication instead?" And I thought, "Oh, that must be like baptism light or something." I just didn't even know what it meant. I just thought it was something they had created, and this was years. You know, this is before I had really thought a lot of these things through. And I thought, sure, that sounds fine. Sounds like a nice compromise. So we get to this thing at the church. We're going to something of a mega church in the Twin Cities. It's a weird Baptist-aligned mega church thing. And we get up in front, and they're doing several kids at the same time. And our son was first. And the minister turns to us and said, do you, the parents of this child, in presenting your child for dedication, you are also witnessing to your own Christian faith. Will you affirm in front of your friends and relatives and everybody you know that you are a believer and a follower in Christ, and that you love Him, and that you will raise your child to be a believer in Christ and guide his feet on the path of righteousness and all this? I had no idea this was coming.
Yeah. This
is what I didn't want. I didn't want to have to get up and lie. I didn't want to have to pledge him to a community. And my wife, bless her heart, I'm in the South, so we say that all the time, squeezed the crap out of my hand. We're standing next to each other, and she squeezed my hand. And this was not a squeeze that meant, isn't this a lovely moment in the life of our child?
Yeah.
This was a squeeze that meant, I am so sorry. I had no idea that this is what you were going to do. If you could please lie like a rug right now in front of my family, that would be great. And so he said, if you can assent to these things, say, we do. And we turned and said, we do. And we didn't, So my suggestion is, first of all, to be better informed than I was about what those things mean, because that was actually a non-negotiable for me. I just didn't know it. That was exactly what I was trying to avoid. When I was growing
up, I remember they used to have the parents come up. They brought the children. They usually anointed it with oil. They would hold the child in front of the entire church body. And it was this, it was it's very ceremonial. You will dedicate the rest of your natural life to raising a godly child. You must have been, you must have felt like about 3 inches tall.
I did. And it's interesting to think if, and this says a lot about my wife at the time. She agreed immediately, I think in the car on the way home, that we would not do that for either of our, for any of our future children. That she was fine to not do that. She was very sorry that she put me in that circumstance, even though it was something that she wanted to do. She didn't want it done to me. So, so I was fortunate in that way. And some people aren't. Some people are in a relationship where the negotiables and non-negotiables are more difficult, and there's more overlap. And so it requires just like anything in a marriage, it requires a willingness in some cases to bend. But that's a give and take. You want to see that people are that the partners are bending on both sides, and finding a compromise that's going to be best for the kids.
I think a lot of what I'm seeing is we were both believers when we got married. I didn't choose to lose my faith. I didn't choose for all of this to end up being complete crap that I walked away from. So it's like I changed the rules on her. She thought she was marrying someone who would be a godly father to their children. And now I'm the one who's like, I don't want to go to church, and I don't want you indoctrinating my kids. We've got a real adversarial thing going on here. That's a pretty thick soup to get through.
It's much more difficult. It is much more difficult for exactly just the way you described it. There was a sort of understanding that the marriage was entered into on one basis, and then something changed. And I have I should mention that I have a survey right now for people who are in these mixed marriages, secular religious marriages. If you go to parentingbeyondbelief.com, there's a link to the survey right there in the sidebar. And one of the things I'm finding, the survey is going to be open for about 10 more days, but one of the things I'm finding is that what you just described is the more difficult configuration. And if there is tension in the mixed marriage, that tends to be the case. If you entered into it secular and religious and remain that way, there's a lot less tension. But making that change requires a whole lot more TLC. It requires a lot more conversation, a lot more reassurance. It's a much more difficult path. And how difficult it is has a lot to do with the denominational identity of the partners. If they were both, for example, Mormon, this tends to be one of the most difficult of all. There can be some very serious shunning in Mormon families. I had somebody came to one of my parenting workshops and looked like he hadn't slept in days, and he told me that he came out to his wife the week before, and they had been Mormon, and she left him with their children that day, with no warning whatsoever, and he didn't even know at this point where she was or where the children were, and no one from his side of the family or her side would talk to him at all. Now, that's just about the worst possible situation, and it comes directly out of the way many Mormon families handle this kind of thing. If you're in a mainline Protestant denomination, it can often be much less dramatic, and there can be a lot more room for negotiation. But if you're Pentecostal, charismatic, evangelical, Mormon, Jehovah's Witness is one of the most difficult. Those are very difficult combinations to work through, and it just requires basically it requires you to draw on everything else you've got in the relationship in terms of having that conversation and working it through. And one of the most important things to do is to communicate as best you can that not everything changed about you when you changed your mind about God. One of the assumptions that's often made by the religious partner is that when you say you're stepping away from Christianity, everything changed about you. You no longer value the good. You're no longer a good person. You're no longer compassionate. All these various things. And if you can go through a process of reassuring that those things haven't changed, that that's still in place, and it doesn't happen in one conversation. But if you can do that, I think that can be the basis for working through it.
Area code 702. Thank you for waiting. You are on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast with Dale McGowan. Who's this?
My name is Paul.
Paul, thanks for calling the show. Hello. What do you have for us tonight?
Well, it's kind of going to piggyback on what you guys just talked about. And I may not really have any further information, but I was wondering if Dale, I'm currently in a split household with my daughter. We have split custody, and my former partner is very religious now, goes to a big mega church, with the coffee shop and everything, and not as cooperative, obviously, into giving our daughter all the different options and letting her choose for herself what to believe or not to believe. And I was just wondering if there's any tips you've had in your research on trying to, do something right on my end. I'm not, trying to make her be an atheist. I want to keep all those doors open. But on the other side of the week, when she's with her mother, she's just getting indoctrinated like crazy. I mean, she'll come home and says, "Hey, mommy says you're going to hell because you don't believe in Jesus," and it's kind of hard to combat. I mean.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. That's a very difficult situation. But yes, there are several things that you can do. I'm actually working on the divorce chapter right now. I've got a lot in the forefront. There's actually a lot of good advice in general from experts on divorce that applies to this kind of situation. Did you say that your wife became more religious than she had been before?
Yeah, definitely so.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's and you have joint custody, so you have the kids for part of the week.
Yeah, we have exactly right down the middle, joint physical, joint legal custody, 3.5 days a week. She's with me, 3.5 days with her.
Oh, terrific. Okay, so even better than the sort of 2 weekends a month kind of thing. That's terrific. Here's what you do. First of all, what you're doing, what you said about you don't want to make her an atheist, that's fantastic. So what the child has, I'm sorry, how old are your children, or is it one child?
Just one child, and she'll be 5 in September.
Okay, 5. Yeah, that's That's a very key age. That's when they start, they often 5 and 6 is when they start asking a lot of questions about this sort of thing. One of the things you want to do is make sure that you're not creating a household where there's a choice. There's one household with Christian choice and one with the atheist choice. What you want to do instead is you've got the religious choice and you've got the free thinking choice, so that you are putting no pressure on the child. You are telling them, I'm going to love you no matter what you decide. This is just say in these words, these are really interesting questions, and whatever you decide, that's I'm going to love you no matter what. Then you're potentially giving the child a choice between one scenario in which she's required to believe something and another one in which she's given freedom. And the child will very often say, you know what, I like the idea of the freedom. I like the idea of being more relaxed about these sorts of things. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, you know, if your wife is doing something so direct as saying that you're going to hell, I think you can very gently say, does that make sense? Do you really think that God would do that sort of thing? If, you know, you love your daddy, I don't think that God would, you know, make a nice man like me burn in hell. A child will immediately see the logic in that. And one of the things that I did with my kids when they were young, which I think can work very well in this situation, is you get God on your side. And you say, even if God exists, I don't think that he would believe hell was a good idea. You know, I think he would just slap himself in the head and say, well, he's come up with these silly ideas, you know, like I'm going to burn people forever because they don't believe in me. And so you can really have these very relaxed conversations around these ideas without indoctrinating the child. But you do want to diffuse that idea of hell. That's a very toxic idea that you want to get out of the way. I've said that that's the one religious idea I don't play fair with. I really don't want my kids to be scared into believing something. So you kind of get that one out of the way, but you let them know that they get to decide, they get to run through the field of ideas themselves. And that's going to put you in the best possible situation in terms of a relationship with your child, and it's going to put her in the best situation in terms of her own exploration of ideas.
And answer your question,
Thank
Paul?
you very much, Dale, and thank you, Seth. I appreciate the information.
It's a great call. Thank you very much. I appreciate you. Hey, Dale, so I've got a situational here, right? I'm a free thinker. I'm an atheist. I don't buy it. I am surrounded by religious relatives, and they are all raising their children in the cocoon of belief. You know, whether it's religious homeschooling or private school, they are completely sheltered from anything that does not say that the earth is 6,000 years old and there were dinosaurs on the ark and all of this stuff that we've seen taught to young children. Now, I, as an atheist, am about to crawl out of my skin. I'm like, these kids don't have a chance. I was just like them 30 some years ago. What can I possibly do? And it's a question I hear often. If you see children being raised in your family, but they're not your kids, is there any recourse? Is there anything we can be doing to help perhaps shed some positive influence in their lives?
Yes, there really is. There are limits to what you can do. Basically, they're the same limits that I would want to apply to somebody else who's coming from the other side at my kids. You know, I don't want to go and do anything sneaky and, you know, pull them aside and teach them about, you know, Darwin or anything. But the most powerful thing you can do is to be out and normal in your family. If your family knows what your beliefs are, and these kids know that Uncle Seth, you know, doesn't believe in God, and then you are the loving and beloved uncle in their life, that is one of the most powerful influences a child can have. Most religious kids don't have that. They are under the impression that everyone around them believes the same. And if you can just be that visible person who doesn't believe and a person that they love, that is the most powerful influence you can have on a child in that situation.
I find myself, and maybe this is the case with others, but I find them sort of shielding. Not shielding, but how much time do we want so-and-so to spend with Seth? You know, how much time how close should they be able to sit to him at the table? I worry that my family fears I'm going to infect someone with atheism. Does that make sense when I say it that way? I mean, it is frustrating.
Oh, I think that's exactly the way they see it. Yeah, I think that's exactly the way it's often seen. And one of the things that you can do is there will be a variety of family members typically. Not everybody will be quite at that level of intensity. And so you just sort of find the people who are more open. You hang out with them at the family reunion. You just, in every way that you possibly can, normalize yourself in relationship to the rest of the family. And some people are going to resist and put a hand out. That's perfectly fine. But in every other way that you can build connections and build sort of normal relationships, you do that. And what I've found in my wife's extended religious family, for example, is that over time, a lot of the issues relax and a lot of the resistance relaxes. And it's based on my personal capital. It's based on what they have come to know and love about me, separate from that question. So the best thing you can do is just sort of, be normal and allow that to evolve.
On Skype, I have The Real Cookie. Hey, thanks for calling the show. What's your real name?
Sean.
Sean, thank you so much for calling the show. What do you have for us tonight?
I had a question for Dale. And, as you said, this is almost related to the children that had the, disabilities, to mental. Yeah. But, what about those kids that have, clinical depression or something? And their friends keep saying, just ask God and he'll help.
Oh, yeah.
Because I find it, annoying and all, so.
Yeah, it's annoying, and it's also, your child is very vulnerable at that point. This is another situation I have to say, because I haven't directly had a child in that situation, there's a limit to what I can say. But in general, one of the ways to help kids weather emotional crises of any depth, in addition to getting whatever professional help you can get them, is as early as possible you make sure that they have positive connections to other kids, to peers, typically built around shared interests. There's actually been a lot of good sociology done on this exact issue, and the fact that there are secular ways to achieve the same connection and feeling of satisfaction that you get with church. And one of the ways to do it is to take an interest that a child has. It could be a musical ensemble or a sports team or volunteering or something like that, or a hobby, or being in theater in high school. And you make sure that early on you connect them with opportunities to get together with other people with shared interests and do something meaningful. That's actually the specific way that sociologists in a 2010 study put this. Getting together with other people with shared interests and doing something meaningful. That ends up giving a lot of the support and encouragement and positive interaction that kids might go looking for in church settings as well. So think about what hobbies and interests your child has, and be sure that they have opportunities to connect with others on that basis.
Okay.
Much appreciated, Sean. Thank you so much for calling the show.
Well, thank you.
Dale McGowan, co-author of the book Parenting Beyond Belief and Raising Free Thinkers. How much influence do you give the grandparents? All right, Grandpa and Grandma are like, you've got to get little Timmy confirmed. You have to have him baptized. You have to do this. You have to do that. How many rights do grandparents have in relation to their grandchildren?
It depends on the situation that you and your spouse have. I was fortunately in a situation where my wife and I were in agreement on these issues. And so if we differed from the grandparents, we could present a united front in that. And as it was, we didn't get that much pressure anyway. But so it does vary along those lines. But it basically comes down to the same idea of negotiables and non-negotiables. But you really don't have to be as flexible with the grandparents. You have to be flexible with your partner. But it's not true when the grandparents come to you and say, you have to get him baptized. No, we don't. If it is a negotiable of yours to do something, if it's something that you really don't care that much about, if it's just, you just see it as a ritual that's not important, then maybe you go with it. But the most important thing is that you and your partner have worked things out, and you can't allow the grandparents to be dictating your parental decisions. That's never a good idea.
I had an email from Anna. She said, my eldest, Dylan, is 4. The others are 2 and 7 months. Dylan, 4 years old, has started asking the odd question like, what are the buildings with crosses on for, Mommy? How do I answer that? Because what I want to say is that's for people who can't tell the difference between reality and silly made-up stories go every week to talk to themselves. So a kid looks up at the church and says, Mom, what's that big building with the cross on it?
Yeah, really, one of the things I talk about a lot is the need for kids to be religiously literate, to know about religion even if they're not involved in it. And this is the way it happens. It doesn't happen in big lectures. It doesn't happen in sermons. They don't have to sit down with the Bible. It happens 15 seconds at a time over the course of 18 years. So when the child looks at that, I remember my daughter at one point looked at a mosque. We actually went by a mosque with a big gold dome, and she said, whoa, look at the pretty building. And I could have just said, yeah, that's pretty, but that would have missed an opportunity. So she was about 4 years old, same age. And I said, oh, yeah, that's actually a kind of a church called a mosque. And it's interesting, people who go to that kind of a church pray 5 times a day, and they face the city far away, and they pray 5 times a day. And that was the whole thing. I didn't get into the 5 pillars of Islam or anything like that, just this little interesting thing. And she was interested. Oh, cool. And she went home and drew a picture of a building with a big yellow dome on top. And then a few months later, we saw a woman in full Islamic garb, the full hijab. And she said, oh, look at her, how weird, or whatever. And I said, oh, you know what? That's somebody who might go to that church that we saw. Remember the mosque that we saw a while ago? She is probably Islamic, and that's somebody who would go to that church. So you take these opportunities just to, for 15 seconds, you just say something when it comes up naturally, and then you connect it to another point of data. And you do this about 5,000 times over the course of 18 years, and you end up with a really religiously literate child, much more so than if they were sitting in a pew in a single denomination all through their childhood. So I would say definitely seize that opportunity and just say, oh, you know what, that's a church. That's where people go who believe in God.
Are kids
that's a beginning.
Are they often smarter than what we give them credit for? I mean, if they look around and they're like, okay, there's a deity, there's a church, there's a prayer, there's a holy book. I mean, are they putting the pieces together better than we?
They are. Not only are they putting them together, but we are often too concerned that they're going to have their brains sucked out. You know, that the mere mention of church and prayer or anything like that is going to just suck them straight in the door of the church. It's not true. That's what happens if you put them in this very confined, indoctrinating space where they're not allowed to explore other ideas. But if this is one of many ideas that they're exploring, it's really just the same as any multiple inputs they're getting in any subject. And we don't have to be afraid of it. They really are capable of working their way through this very well without sort of collapsing into the arms of Jesus.
Area code 347. Thanks for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast with my guest, Dale McGowan. Who's this?
Hi, Seth. This is Azza. How are you?
Azza, so glad you called the show. What do you have for us tonight?
Well, first, I wanted to say that I really love your show because you address issues like this, which is, you know, how free-thinker parents might raise a free-thinker child. But what I wanted to say to Dale was your approach is really interesting because I come from a Muslim family, and they raised me with the same guidelines that you're talking about.
Yeah,
so
right.
That when I turned out to, you know, say that I was an atheist, it really wasn't a very big deal.
Right.
So were they just cultural Muslims? I mean, is that the deal, that they weren't true adherents to the Quran? Or, I mean, how do you get from I
would kind of say that we were Islam light. So, in other words, probably nominally Muslim, but never went to a mosque and never really read from the Quran and things like that. So, and that was, I think, well, I know for a fact that was sort of their attempt to, you know, raise a free thinker. They did not want me indoctrinated. They did not want me, you know, wearing a headscarf. They did not want me thinking that I had to do any of that.
Right.
Which I'm actually very thankful for.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so glad you called in, because this is everybody has a tendency to paint a cartoon of the other side of this question. religious people paint a cartoon of atheism. They think everybody's very much the same, and immoral and cold-hearted and whatever. And we turn around and do much the same to religious people in many cases. I think we tend to be surprised by a story like this because we don't recognize the very wide spectrum of people who call themselves religious. So there are some who really want to indoctrinate their children, really want to pass that on, who are afraid of hell, who are seeking salvation, and so on. But there's actually a very, very wide religious spectrum of people who are just as you described. There are religious people who are raising their children to think for themselves and who will love their children no matter what they decide. And to hear that from an Islamic perspective is terrific. I've heard it many, many times from Jewish and Christian perspectives. Certainly from the Hindu perspective, that's not all that uncommon. So that's a really good thing to say out loud and recognize that we are not actually the only ones who are doing this.
Anything else for me, Asha?
Actually, well, the interesting thing in the case of my family is that in Turkey, which is where we're from, there are actually secular Muslims, and that happens to be the kind of Muslims that my parents were, where they did believe that a person's relationship with God is very personal, and it doesn't need to be in schools, and it doesn't need to be out in the public, and it doesn't need to be given any sort of special status. It's whether a person believes or not is their business because it's their relationship or lack thereof. And I think that actually helped with the decision that I think my parents ultimately made, not to have sort of a more orthodox line of thought.
Asha, thanks for your perspective and for a great call, and appreciate you listening to the show.
Thanks.
All
Bye-bye.
right, take care. Let's do one more before we talk about the book, because I'm very curious about it. Let's talk to Kat on Skype. Kat, you're on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast. Thanks for calling. What's going on?
Hi, Seth.
Hi.
I actually wanted to go ahead and say to our guest of the day that you have done an amazing thing with your kids. Dale, I'm really, really happy to hear there are other parents out there that are trying to raise, kids who are free thinkers. My parents were both very religious, but their whole thing about raising me and my brother was, we're going to raise you to be open-minded and thoughtful individuals.
Yeah.
It was it was a great childhood, to say the least. I experienced so much. I mean, I got into, what did I get into? I got into Christianity, Catholicism. I even went down the weirdest path and became a Jehovah's Witness for about 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
That was scary. And then I told them to stop coming to my house. But no, what you're doing is actually really, really amazing. And I just want to say thank you, because it is people like you who are going to help in getting the truth out there as to what children really need to be learning.
Awesome stuff, Kat.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for calling
Seth,
the show.
2 things for you,
Yes,
real
ma'am.
quick.
Yes, ma'am.
Everybody in the chat is wanting to know what you want for a wedding gift.
Nothing. I just want. Look, I'm a man. I don't need anything. Are you kidding?
And 2, you've lost the game.
Thanks for nothing. Dale, it's a running gag. Don't worry about it. Don't waste your life on it. Kat, say hi to your hubby, all right? We'll catch you later.
All right.
All right.
Bye,
Take it easy. You are a co-author of the book called Parenting Beyond Belief.
Right.
And a book called Raising Free Thinkers. This is like a how-to guide. Walk me through it. Is this like something that parents can grab and sort of go chapter by chapter? Oh, look, my little Timmy's 3. Let's go to chapter. What are we talking about here, Dale?
Well, they're really conceived as companion books for each other. Parenting Beyond Belief has 27 contributors, and it is a series of essays. So there are essays on specific topics. It starts with personal reflections, but then there's a chapter on secular family in a religious world, all the issues that come up with being in that religious context. There's a chapter on moral development, which is several essays in each one of these chapters by different contributors. Chapter on death, chapter on community. So it's sort of taking each one of the issues, but each chapter includes a lot of different voices, and in some cases, people taking different approaches to a lot of these questions. But it is essay form. Raising Free Thinkers is sort of the practical companion to Parenting Beyond Belief. So it's built around 100 Q&As, specific questions in these different topic areas. And then it also has activities and resources and book reviews and all that sort of thing. So that's a much more practical. You can sort of flip to the answer for suggested ways to approach a particular issue. So that's the way the books work together.
Talk to me quickly about Atheism for Dummies, because it's just an awesome title. I mean, there's so many For Dummies books out there. Atheism for Dummies is what? Are you dispelling all the misconceptions about these monstrous heathens? I mean, what is it about?
Yeah, that's part of it. The idea, the publisher of the For Dummies series approached me to write this, and my first reaction was I couldn't believe there wasn't one yet. They didn't 1,600 books in the series, and they didn't have one yet for atheism. They had Catholicism, Mormonism. They had various books of the Bible that already had book. There was Logic for Dummies. There's Gardening for Dummies. My favorite is eBay for Canadians for Dummies. They had before they had Atheism for Dummies. I really couldn't believe it. So they made it clear that what they wanted was a very easygoing, relaxed, accessible introduction to atheism. And it dispels a lot of misconceptions. It defines a lot of the terms. It gets a handle on sort of the various philosophical aspects of it and all that. That's the first section. Then there's a historical section that goes all the way through the history of various eras and atheists and agnostics. Then great works. We look at a lot of different books and other writings all through the centuries. Then actually one of my favorite sections is on basically everyday atheism. What's it like to be an atheist in the world, in the United States, but I also talk about various cultures around the world. I get into statistics and demographics and how is it different to be an atheist in Scandinavia compared to the United States, compared to Quebec, sort of a lot of different approaches to that question, how atheists think about death and morality and so on. And then the last section is basically a lot of lists of 10. This is something that the Dummies books always do. 10 people you probably didn't know were atheists and that sort of thing. So it was incredibly fun to put together because I got to be less serious than, I got to relax and cut loose a little bit. In addition to the parenting stuff and all that, I run a humanist charity. So I spend a lot of time being very earnest, and this was an opportunity to just let my hair down a little bit. And the result has been a book that I think a lot of people have said, this is the book I want to give my Aunt Mildred, who just knows I'm an atheist and she loves me, but she just doesn't get it. She just doesn't know what in the world I'm on about. I wanted a book to hand her, and this is the one. So that's always one of my favorite things to hear.
If I can use your phrasing, the light touch of it is probably a way to keep the guard from going up. People are, if you give them a Dawkins book, they're ready. Oh, yeah. It's time to put on the boxing gloves. You give them Atheism for Dummies, and the first thing that happens is you get a smile on their face, and
exactly.
kind of disarmed. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's very much the part of the approach. And one of the things they actually encouraged from the beginning is to poke fun at ourselves. And so I was able to occasionally, poke a little fun at the atheist community, which is right for it anyway. There are all sorts of things that are funny about us. So that also helps to drop that guard a little bit.
I'll make sure and put links to all these books in the description box of this radio show. I'm also going to put the link to your Oklahoma Free Thought Convention speech. It runs like 30 minutes, plus you did some Q&A. I lamented the fact we didn't have really very good mics on the questions, but I think the video viewer can sort of get it. But you did some great examples. You went further into depth on how you kind of went through some of the challenges with your own kids. And I'll also include your secular parenting blog called The Memeing of Life. I'm curious. I'm getting ready to try to tackle. I like to do one charity thing a year, and I've been kind of vetting different secular charities. What charity are you involved with, or run, or founded? I mean, what are we talking about here?
Well, the one that I founded in 2010 is called Foundation Beyond Belief. And the idea was we wanted to give humanists and atheists an opportunity to engage in philanthropy, engage in supporting charities around the world as an expression, a direct expression of our humanism. And this is an advantage that churchgoers have. They, once a week, they go, they sit down in a room, they hear an inspirational talk about the need in the world, and then the shiny plate is passed, and they have an opportunity to give to that need. A lot of the money doesn't get outside of that building, but that's another question. So I wanted to give humanists an opportunity to engage in regular charitable giving. And so if you can sign up for a contributing membership for as little as $5 a month, any amount that you want. And then we feature 5 charities per quarter in 5 categories. And members are able to distribute their funds among the 5 however they'd like. So if they are particularly interested in human rights, they support the human rights charity each quarter, or they can split it between human rights and poverty, however they want to do this. And just, about 10 days ago, I think it is now, we passed $1 million in total giving since the launch of the organization.
Weren't you guys heavily involved after the tornadoes hit Oklahoma City? You guys were over there doing some good over there.
Right. There were a lot of groups on the ground there, a lot of local groups in Oklahoma, and we headed up a pledge drive, a fund drive, for the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma, which was feeding people in the aftermath, and then also Operation USA, which was doing a lot of disaster relief and sheltering and that sort of thing. We ended up contributing over $45,000 to the relief effort, and that included the purchase of 100,000 meals for the survivors of the storm. So it was a very, very successful drive. A lot of people, a lot of bloggers, and people from around the free thought community came together for that.
I think I'm going to follow up with you here as we approach the fall season, and we may have to talk about Foundation Beyond Belief as part of some study. This community is always eager to do some tangible good. Many have been shafted by charities that either end up taking a lot of it for administration and nothing gets to the people, or it's all about Jesus, right? Yeah. They want to feed their bodies, but mostly they're going for the soul. So the idea of being able to support an organization that's really just about doing good for goodness sake is really attractive. Really attractive. Great. Dale McGowan, you're a great guest, and I'm going to do you a favor. The description box of this show will be your friend, and there'll be links to everything that you could possibly need, including the books and the blogs and the speech at Oklahoma Free Thought. Thanks for your great work, and thanks for spending 90 minutes on the air with us, Dale. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, I appreciate it very much, Seth. Thank you.
Make sure and join us for next Tuesday's show as I talk to a former Louisiana Pentecostal preacher who's now an infidel. He's also been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, CNN, and pretty much everywhere else. His name is Jerry DeWitt, a precious human being who's really making a difference out there. The show's called Hope After Faith. It is next Tuesday night on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. I'll see you then.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.